My name is Cassidy Palmer. I'm 36 years old, and the day we buried my father should have been the one day my family could pretend to love him more than they loved money. I should have known better. The service had barely ended when everyone drifted into that quiet little reception room with paper cups of coffee and polite funeral voices, the kind people use when they want to sound heartbroken without actually feeling anything. I was still trying to process the fact that my father, Douglas Palmer, was really gone when my older sister pushed back her chair, crossed her arms, and smiled like she had been waiting all afternoon for her turn. Then she said, clear as day, "We're selling the house. I need the money." For a second, I honestly thought grief was making me hear things. I stared at her and said, "You want to sell Dad's house right after his funeral?" Before she could answer, my mother looked at me with the same cold expression I had known since I was a teenager and said, "Be quiet. Your sister is the one who needs help." Help. That was the word she chose. Not debt, not gambling, not desperation, just help, as if ruining our father's memory before the flowers on his grave had even settled was somehow an act of compassion. The room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioning kick on. A few relatives looked down at their hands. A few stared at the table. Not one person told her she was out of line. And just when I realized this wasn't grief talking, it was a plan they had already made without me. The door opened. My father's lawyer walked in carrying a thick file, set it down in front of all of us, and said, "Maybe you should hear this first." My sister grabbed the top page, skimmed it, and all the color drained from her face. Then she screamed, "What? No, this can't be happening." In that moment, I knew my father had left behind a lot more than a house. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're listening from and what the weather is like there. I just want to know how far my story can travel. By the time my sister started screaming over those papers, I already knew two things. First, whatever was in that file was something she had never seen coming. Second, this whole ugly scene had not started at the funeral. It had started years earlier in all the little moments when my family decided that Miranda could always be rescued and I could always be expected to survive on my own. My father died 2 nights before that reception. My mother called me a little after midnight while I was still awake in my apartment in Denver, half watching some mindless late-night TV and half answering work emails I should have ignored until morning. Her voice was flat, too flat, and that scared me more than if she had been crying. She said my father had collapsed at home and the ambulance had taken him to the hospital. She didn't say much more than that. She just told me to come now. I threw on the first sweater I could find, grabbed my keys, and drove through the dark with my heart pounding so hard it made my hands shake on the steering wheel. It was one of those freezing Colorado nights when the roads look empty and endless, and every red light feels personal. I kept telling myself he would still be there when I arrived. I kept thinking I would walk into his room, hear one of his dry little jokes, and get annoyed at myself later for panicking. But when I got there, I knew before anyone said a word. My mother was sitting in one of those stiff hospital chairs with her purse in her lap like she was waiting for a dentist appointment. Miranda was standing beside the vending machines, wiping at her face, but even then something about it felt off. She looked upset, sure, but not shattered. More like inconvenienced. My father had been gone for 20 minutes by the time I made it to the floor. 20 minutes. That number stayed in my head like a bruise. I never got to say goodbye. I never got to hear his voice one last time. I never got to ask him if he knew how much I had spent my whole adult life wanting him to say, just once, that he saw what was happening in our family and that he knew it was wrong. My father was not a cruel man. That would have been easier to understand. He was the kind of man who showed love in practical ways and silence in emotional ones. He paid bills on time. He fixed things before they broke. He remembered the mileage on everybody's cars and the due dates on insurance policies. But when it came to conflict, especially conflict involving Miranda and my mother, he went quiet. And in our house, silence always helped the loudest person. That was usually my mother. When we were kids, Miranda was the one everyone described as delicate, emotional, complicated. I was the easy one, the reliable one, the one who didn't make scenes. That sounds like a compliment until you grow up and realize it usually means nobody checks whether you're hurting. Miranda got comfort. I got expectations. Miranda got second chances. I got speeches about responsibility. By high school, the pattern was so normal nobody even pretended it wasn't happening. If Miranda wanted something, the conversation was always about how to make it happen. If I needed something, the conversation became about why I should be able to handle it myself. When Miranda got into a private college for one semester before dropping out, my parents helped pay for her car and her apartment because, according to my mother, she needed stability. When I got into school, I was told I was smart enough to figure it out. And I did. I filled out financial aid forms by myself at the kitchen table. I worked weekends, covered my own books, and learned very early that the phrase "you're stronger than your sister" was just another way of saying, don't ask for too much. Miranda drifted from job to job after that. A boutique for 6 months, a dental office for 4. Some startup that supposedly loved her energy until it didn't. Every time something fell apart, there was always a reason that made her the victim. Bad management, toxic coworkers, stress, anxiety, wrong timing. And every single time my mother stepped in like this was just what families do. Rent paid, credit card covered, car note caught up. Meanwhile, I built my life one careful decision at a time because I knew no one was coming to save me if I messed it up. By the time I was in my 30s, I had stopped expecting fairness. But standing in that hospital hallway, staring at the doors I had been too late to walk through, I did let myself believe one foolish thing. I believed that losing my father might be the one event big enough to strip away all the pretending. I thought grief might make everybody honest. I thought maybe, for once, we would all remember what actually mattered. I had no idea that before my father was even buried, my mother and sister would turn his death into their next financial plan. The next morning, I drove out to my parents' house in Littleton with a change of clothes, a headache from not sleeping, and that strange numb feeling grief gives you when your body understands something your mind still refuses to accept. My father had lived in that house for almost 30 years. It was a solid craftsman place on a quiet street, with old trees out front, a deep driveway, and a front porch he had repainted so many times, I could probably still name the brands of stain he trusted. That house had been the one stable thing in our family for as long as I could remember. No matter how tense things got inside it, the place itself always felt grounded, like it had better sense than the people living there. I sat in my car for a minute before going in, because I already knew the second I stepped through that front door, it would stop being my father's house and start turning into something else. Inside, it still smelled faintly like his coffee and the cedar polish he used on the hallway table. His jacket was hanging by the mudroom door. His reading glasses were still on the end table beside his chair in the den. A legal pad sat on the kitchen counter with his handwriting on it, a short list of things he had probably planned to get done that week. Pick up filters, call irrigation guy, renew registration. Seeing those ordinary little notes nearly broke me more than the hospital had. Death in a hospital feels distant, unreal. Death in a house shows up in objects. It sits in the places a person was about to return to and never did. I was standing there staring at that legal pad when Miranda breezed into the kitchen in expensive athleisure and full makeup, like she had somewhere more important to be after losing our father. She gave me a quick, airless hug and asked if I could stop blocking the refrigerator because she needed oat milk for her coffee. That was Miranda. Even on the worst day of someone else's life, she could still make herself the center of the room. I stepped aside and watched her move around the kitchen like she belonged to some version of this family I had never been invited into. Then I started noticing things. At first, it was small stuff: two Sephora bags on a dining chair, a ring light set up in the guest room, a new pair of designer sneakers kicked off by the back door. But the longer I stood there, the stranger it got. There were delivery boxes everywhere, some from department stores, some from electronics brands, some still unopened. On the entry bench sat a handbag I knew cost more than my monthly car payment. On the kitchen counter was a brand new tablet still in the box. In the downstairs bathroom, I found 3 different luxury skincare products lined up like she was living in a hotel she intended to rate later. My old bedroom, the one my mother used to call my room even after I moved out, had been turned into Miranda's overflow closet. Dresses in dry cleaning bags hung from the window frame. Heels lined the wall. Makeup cases covered the desk where I used to do homework. It did not look like someone staying there for a night or two after a family emergency. It looked like someone who had been slowly moving in while the rest of us were distracted. My mother came in carrying a stack of folded black clothes and acted like none of it was unusual. I asked, as calmly as I could, "How long has Miranda been staying here?" She didn't even look up. She just said, "A while. She needed support." There it was again. Needed. Support. Help. My family had a whole vocabulary for protecting Miranda from the consequences of her own decisions. Later that afternoon, while my mother was on the phone with the funeral home and Miranda was supposedly showering, I heard them talking in the breakfast nook with their voices lowered in that fake, careful way people use when they absolutely do not want you to hear. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough. My mother said, "It has to happen quickly." Miranda said, "I know. Once the house is listed, I can breathe again." Then my mother said, "We cannot let this drag out." I froze in the hallway. Listed, not discussed, not considered. Listed. They were not grieving. They were planning. And whatever they were planning, they had clearly decided I was either too soft to stop them or too irrelevant to matter. That night, I went out to the garage because I needed air and because the garage had always been the one place in the house that still felt like my father entirely. His tools were arranged with the same neat logic he used for everything. Extension cords hung coiled on hooks. Screws were sorted into labeled bins. On a shelf above the workbench sat a small metal fire safe I remembered from years ago. I almost left it alone. Then I remembered my mother's tone when she said, "We cannot let this drag out," and something in me shifted. The safe was unlocked. Inside were folders, insurance papers, old tax returns, and one document that made me stop cold. It had the house address on it, along with the name of a legal entity I didn't recognize. And at the bottom of one page was my signature. I just stared at it. My own signature, dated more than a decade earlier. Then I remembered being 23, home for a weekend, and my father asking me to sign a few pages because, as he put it, "It's just housekeeping stuff. Easier to handle now than later." At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. My father loved paperwork the way other people loved hobbies. But standing in that garage with that folder in my hands, I suddenly knew 2 things. My father had not forgotten those papers, and my mother had lied when she acted like everything about the house was simple. I slipped the folder into my tote bag just as the door from the kitchen opened, and my mother called out asking what I was doing. I looked at the safe, then back at her, and said the first true thing that came to mind. Trying to figure out what Dad knew that nobody else wanted me to see. The funeral was held the next afternoon at a quiet chapel just outside Littleton, one of those places designed to make grief look orderly. Soft carpet, polished wood, muted flowers, a piano playing somewhere in the background, everything arranged so people could cry in a respectable way and still make it back to their cars before the weather turned. I barely remember half the faces I saw walking in. Neighbors, My father's old business contacts. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. People who all seemed ready to speak warmly about the man we had lost, while I stood there feeling like I was holding my breath inside someone else's life. I kept the folder from the garage in my bag the whole time. I told myself I would wait. I told myself I would not make a scene at my father's funeral. I told myself there would be time later to figure out what those papers meant. Miranda, of course, had no such instincts. She arrived looking perfectly composed, like grief had somehow made her more polished. Her black dress probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her makeup was flawless, and she wore the kind of expression people mistake for strength, when what it really means is performance. When she stepped up to speak, she did a good job. I'll give her that. She talked about my father's work ethic, his dry humor, the way he checked the locks every night before bed. She even mentioned how much he loved that house, which almost made me laugh out loud from the sheer nerve of what came next. Because the second she sat down, she did not let the room breathe. She stayed standing, looked around at all of us, and said, "There's something practical we need to address as a family. We're selling the house." A few people shifted in their seats, confused enough that nobody interrupted her. Then she added, with the confidence of someone who thought the decision had already been blessed from above, "It's the smartest thing to do, and honestly, I need the money." The words landed with a kind of hard silence that made my skin go cold. Not we should talk about it. Not mom may need help deciding what to do next. Just I need the money. I turned to her and said, "You want to sell Dad's house right after we buried him?" My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room anyway. Before Miranda could answer, my mother stepped in exactly the way I should have expected. She straightened in her chair, gave me that sharp look that had shut me down since I was 16, and said, "Be quiet, Cassidy. Your sister is the one who needs help." There it was again. That same word, polished and harmless on the outside, hiding every rotten thing underneath it. Help. Around us, relatives started doing what relatives always do when they sense drama and don't want to risk being on the wrong side of it. They avoided eye contact. They stared into their paper coffee cups. One of my aunts mumbled something about how hard this must be on everyone. One of my cousins nodded like Miranda had made a painful but mature point. I stood there realizing that in less than 5 minutes, my father's funeral had somehow become a strategy meeting about liquidating the one thing he had spent his whole life protecting. Then Miranda, maybe feeling bolder because no one had stopped her, reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She turned the screen toward my mother first, then half toward the rest of us. "I already talked to someone," she said. "A realtor said houses on this block move fast. If we list it right away, we can probably get offers before the month is over." It took everything in me not to lunge across the room and rip the phone out of her hand. She had already called a realtor. She had already started the process. This was never grief. This was timing. My mother leaned in and nodded like this was all perfectly reasonable. "It's what your father would have wanted," she said. That was the moment something in me went from hurt to cold. Because no, it wasn't. I didn't even need the papers in my bag to know that. My father was many things, but reckless with that house was not one of them. I opened my mouth to say exactly that when the chapel door swung open behind us. Every head in the room turned. My father's attorney, Victor Lang, walked in carrying a thick file against his chest. He did not rush. He did not apologize for interrupting. He simply crossed the room, set the file down on the nearest table, and looked directly at my mother and sister before saying, very calmly, "Before anyone makes another decision about this house, you should hear what your husband put in writing." Miranda snatched the top page before anyone could stop her. She scanned it once, then again, and the color drained out of her face so fast it was almost shocking. Her mouth opened, but for a second no sound came out. Then she finally screamed, "No, this can't be right." And in that instant, with half our family staring and the other half pretending not to, I knew my father had seen this coming long before any of us did. After Miranda shouted that the papers had to be wrong, the room broke into the kind of chaos people later describe as if it happened slowly, even though it actually happened all at once. My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. An aunt near the wall gasped like someone had sworn in church. Miranda kept flipping through the pages with shaking hands, as if reading them faster might somehow change what they said. Victor Lang, meanwhile, stayed completely calm. He waited just long enough for everyone to realize he was not going to be drowned out by panic. Then he said, "Mrs. Palmer, Cassidy, if you're able, I would prefer to discuss the legal details in a more appropriate setting." Miranda snapped back immediately. "No, discuss them right now, in front of everybody, because this is insane." Victor gave her one measured look, the kind adults use on children who have confused volume with authority. "The paperwork is valid," he said. "Your father made arrangements years ago. If you'd like to challenge that, you are free to speak with your own counsel." My mother grabbed Miranda's arm and told her to sit down, but neither of them looked like they had any idea what to do next. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt numb. My father had barely been buried, and already his last act was being dragged into a fight he had clearly spent years trying to prevent. Victor turned to me then and quietly asked if I could meet him at his office first thing the next morning. I said yes before my mother could answer for me. She started to protest, but I was already done being managed. "I'll be there," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I heard my own voice sound firm enough that even she backed off. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my head. Miranda's face draining of color, my mother's anger turning into fear, the way Victor had said years ago. My father had known, not suspected, not worried in theory, known. The next morning, I drove to Victor's office in downtown Denver with the folder from the garage on the passenger seat beside me, and a knot in my stomach so tight I thought I might be sick. His office was on the 8th floor of an older brick building, quiet and formal in a way that immediately made me feel underdressed no matter what I wore. He met me himself, led me into a conference room, and set two folders on the table between us. One was the packet Miranda had grabbed at the chapel. The other, he explained, contained supporting documents, annual filings, and correspondence from my father going back more than a decade. "Cassidy," he said, folding his hands, "your father was a cautious man. He did not do anything about this house impulsively." Then he opened the file and began walking me through it. 15 years earlier, my father had transferred the house into a legal structure designed to protect it from exactly the kind of situation we were now facing. The house was no longer just a family asset waiting to be divided by emotion, guilt, or pressure. Control over it had been assigned very specifically, and that control belonged to me. I stared at him, sure I had misunderstood. "Me?" I said. "Why me?" Victor's expression softened, just slightly. "Because your father believed you were the only one who would keep the property intact." He let that sit for a second before adding, "He was concerned that if the house remained exposed, it would eventually be used to solve your sister's financial problems." I looked down at the documents in front of me, at my own signature from years ago, and felt a strange mix of grief and clarity settle over me. All this time, while I had assumed my father saw what was happening and chose not to act, he had been acting in the only way he thought would actually last. Victor slid one final sheet across the table. It was a handwritten letter from my father. Just one page. My throat tightened before I even read the first line. He wrote that he knew I had often been asked to carry more than was fair. He wrote that I had spent most of my life being treated like the child who could manage without protection, and that he regretted how often silence had made that burden heavier. He wrote that he loved Miranda, But he would not let the home he had worked his whole life to keep become the final payment on her destruction. Then came the line that undid me completely. You do not confuse love with rescue, and that is why I trust you. I had to stop reading for a moment because my vision blurred so badly I couldn't see the page. My father had never been good with emotional language when he was alive. He was practical, reserved, uncomfortable with anything that sounded too vulnerable. But there, in black ink on expensive legal stationery, was the clearest thing he had ever said to me. Victor waited until I had composed myself before speaking again. There will need to be a formal reading, he said. Your mother and sister are not going to accept this quietly. I gave a small, humorless laugh. No, I said. They won't. Then I looked back at my father's letter, read that line one more time, and felt something inside me shift into place. For years, my family had mistaken my silence for surrender. They were about to learn the difference. The formal meeting happened 2 days later in Victor Lang's office, and by then the panic in my mother's voice had been replaced by something even worse: confidence. Not real confidence, of course. The kind people wear when they have already convinced themselves that if they push hard enough, reality will eventually give in. When I walked into the conference room, Miranda was already there, sitting stiff in one of the leather chairs with her arms folded tight across her chest. My mother sat beside her, jaw set, eyes hard, like I was the one dragging the family through humiliation instead of the person who had tried to stop it. My grandmother, Marjorie Dean, was near the end of the table, quiet and watchful. 2 of my aunts had come too, which told me my mother had expected this to turn into a performance. She wanted an audience. She wanted pressure. She wanted me outnumbered. What she did not want was paperwork. Victor came in with 3 folders, placed them on the table, and began in the same calm tone he had used at the funeral. He explained that the house had been transferred years ago into a protected legal structure created by my father, Douglas Palmer. He explained that all filings had been maintained properly, all documents had been notarized, and all control had been legally assigned. Then he said the one sentence Miranda had probably been dreading since the moment she grabbed those papers at the chapel. The property is under Cassidy Palmer's control, and it is not available for sale without her consent. Miranda laughed, but it came out jagged and desperate. That's ridiculous, she said. Dad would never do that. She talked him into it. Victor did not even blink. He slid copies of the dates, signatures, and annual filings across the table. These arrangements were made more than a decade ago, he said, long before Mr. Palmer's health declined and long before this current dispute. My mother leaned forward and pushed the papers away like they offended her. This is cruel, she said. You know her sister is struggling. I looked at her and almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Struggling. Even now, she still wanted to wrap everything in soft language, as if changing the word could change the damage. Victor, to his credit, did not let her hide behind it. Mrs. Palmer, he said evenly, your daughter's financial issues do not override your husband's legal decisions. That was when Miranda finally cracked. She slammed her hand on the table so hard one of my aunts jumped. Fine, she snapped. You want the truth? I owe money. A lot of money. Happy now? Nobody answered. The room was too still for a second, like everyone had been waiting years to hear her say it out loud. My mother started crying then, not softly, not gracefully, but in those sharp, angry bursts that sound more like frustration than grief. She admitted Miranda had been drowning for years. Sports betting, credit cards, personal loans, cash advances, money borrowed from friends who had stopped answering her calls, money borrowed from family members who never got paid back. At some point, the number came out, and even hearing it made my stomach drop. It was more than $300,000. My grandmother closed her eyes for a second like she was physically tired of all of us. One of my aunts whispered, My God, under her breath. And suddenly everything made sense. The funeral announcement, the realtor, the urgency, the way my mother kept saying help like it was a holy word. They had not been planning for the future. They had been trying to throw my father's house into a fire big enough to cover Miranda's mess for another year, maybe less. Miranda turned to me then, and for the first time since all of this started, she stopped pretending to be offended and just looked scared. "Cassidy," she said, her voice shaking now, "I just need one chance to fix it." I believed she believed that. That was the tragedy of Miranda. She always thought the next rescue would be the one that changed her. I sat up straighter and said the words I had been moving toward my entire life. "I'm not selling the house." My mother made a wounded sound, but I kept going. "You can stay there, Mom. I'll draw up a lease at $1 a month if that's what it takes to keep things stable for you. But Miranda does not move in, and this house does not get sold to pay gambling debts." Miranda stared at me like I had slapped her. "You do this to your own sister?" she said. I held her gaze and answered as calmly as Victor had answered all of us. "No, I'm refusing to do what everyone else has done for years. Swach." Then I told her the only offer I was willing to make. If she entered a real 90-day treatment program and completed it, I would help cover treatment costs. Recovery? Yes. Debt? No. Rescue? No. "Helping you get better is not the same as funding what's destroying you," I said. That was the moment the room changed. Not because Miranda understood. She didn't. Not yet. But because everyone else finally did. My grandmother looked at my mother and said, in the coldest voice I had ever heard from her, Douglas knew exactly what he was doing. And for once, nobody argued with her. What happened after that was not dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. There were no last-minute apologies, no miraculous turnaround, no sudden moment where my sister saw the truth and became a different person. Real consequences are usually quieter than that. They arrive in phone calls, canceled accounts, overdue notices, and doors that stop opening for you. Within a week, Miranda's life started collapsing in ways even my mother could not cover anymore. Her SUV was repossessed from the parking lot outside a coffee shop. 2 credit cards were frozen. A lender filed for collection. One of her friends showed up to get back money she had borrowed months earlier and never repaid. The luxury bags, the electronics, the polished image she had worked so hard to maintain all started disappearing piece by piece. And for the first time, there was no family asset left to throw in front of the damage. My mother tried to plead with me twice more, but even she sounded tired by then, like she was finally beginning to understand that protecting Miranda had never actually saved her. It had only delayed the fall and made it bigger. 3 weeks later, after one more meltdown and one more call from a creditor that left her shaking, Miranda checked into a 90-day treatment program. Not because she had suddenly become honest, and not because she wanted to make things right, but because she had finally run out of places to hide. My mother stayed in the house under the lease I gave her, and the first few months between us were stiff and awkward. Then one evening, while I was helping clear out boxes in the garage, she said something I had waited years to hear. She told me she had spent so long seeing me as the daughter who could handle everything that she stopped noticing how much that had cost me. It was not a perfect apology, but it was real, and by then, real was enough. My grandmother, Marjorie Dean, put it more clearly than anyone else. She looked around the house my father had protected and said, "Loving one child does not mean sacrificing the other." That was the truth my whole family had avoided for years. In the end, my sister paid a high price for every lie, every bet, every time she expected someone else to clean up the damage. She lost her car, her image, her access to easy money, and the illusion that being loved meant being rescued forever. As for me, I kept the house. I repainted my old room, cleaned out my father's workbench, and left his favorite coffee mug exactly where it had always been. And the biggest lesson I took from all of it was this: setting boundaries is not cruelty, and refusing to fund someone's destruction is not betrayal. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is be the first person who finally says no. At Revenge Argon, our team works hard to create meaningful and engaging fictional stories that do more than entertain. We are committed to sharing creative narratives with educational value, thoughtful life lessons, and positive messages for our viewers. After hearing this story, which character did you like the most, and why? Also, what kind of story topic would you like us to create next on Revenge Argon?